My name is Claire Ellison. I am 41 years old, and for the past 3 years, my mother, my sister, and roughly half the people I grew up going to church with have been told that I abandoned the family, that I refused to help when my sister needed me, and that I turned my back on my own mother over money. That version of events has been repeated at Thanksgiving tables, in text threads I was removed from, in a conversation my cousin had with my former neighbor at a Kroger in Decatur, Georgia, on a Wednesday afternoon in October. I know this because my cousin called me 11 minutes later and read me the transcript she typed into her notes app while pretending to look for coupons. The exact words attributed to me, spoken by my mother to anyone who would listen, were these: Claire was offered a fair share and refused it because she wanted everything for herself. I am here to correct the record, permanently. I was standing in my kitchen when my cousin read me that line. I had just pulled a tray of roasted tomatoes from the oven, and the skins had split in the heat the way they do when the internal moisture exceeds what the membrane can hold. I set the tray on the counter. I did not respond for several seconds. My hands were still in the oven mitts, and I could feel the residual heat pressing through the lining against my palms. I stood there. Something in me went very quiet, not empty, just precise. I was already thinking about file dates. That was my profession paying off before I even recognized it. I am a records compliance analyst for a regional healthcare network. I have spent 14 years reviewing document chains, intake forms, billing records, authorization paperwork, insurance correspondence, identifying discrepancies between what a file says happened and what the audit trail proves actually occurred. I am trained to notice when a date doesn't match a signature, when a document was created after the event it supposedly authorized, when metadata tells a different story than the cover page. That skill had caught billing irregularities worth six figures in clinical audits over the past decade. It was about to dismantle my own mother's version of our family history, line by line. Before I show you the evidence that makes my mother's version of events structurally impossible, where are you watching from? Because the version of this story that's been circulating has probably already reached people like you in some form. Someone who seems reasonable, someone who speaks with authority, someone whose tears arrive at exactly the right moment. I want you to have the real one. My grandmother, Louise Ellison, died on March 14, 2021. She was 87. She had lived in the same house on Lake Hartwell since 1974, a three-bedroom cedar-sided place with a dock that needed replacing every 8 years, and a kitchen window that faced east so the morning light came straight through the glass and hit the countertop at an angle that made the old Formica look almost golden. I spent every summer of my childhood in that house. My sister Denise did too, though by the time she was 14 she had started calling it the shack and asking to stay home with friends instead. My grandmother left the lake house to me, specifically to me, not to my mother, not split between me and Denise, to me. Her will was drawn up by Harold Crenshaw, an attorney in Anderson, South Carolina, who had handled her affairs since 1998. The will was filed with the Oconee County Probate Court. The language was unambiguous. I was named as sole beneficiary of the lake property, along with the contents inside it. The remainder of her estate, a modest savings account of approximately $43,000 and a life insurance policy, was split between my mother and Denise. My mother did not contest the will, not publicly. What she did instead was more efficient. Within 6 weeks of my grandmother's death, while I was still handling the transfer of the deed and arranging for a plumber to winterize the pipes, my mother began telling me that the property taxes on the lake house were more than you realize, that the dock repair was going to cost north of $15,000, that she'd spoken with a realtor friend who said the market was soft and I should consider selling before it dropped further. She mentioned this casually, the way she mentions everything, mid-sentence, while doing something else, as though the thought had just occurred to her and she was doing me a kindness by sharing it. You might want to think about letting it go before it eats you alive, honey. These old places always do. That was my mother's way. Every directive arrived dressed as concern. Every manipulation introduced itself as maternal wisdom. She never demanded. She suggested, with the thermostat set exactly where she wanted it, and if you disagreed, she adjusted the temperature until you couldn't tell whether you were cold because of the room or because of the silence. Meanwhile, Denise had launched a business, an interior staging company she called Flourish and Frame. She had quit her job at a property management firm in Atlanta, leased a warehouse space in Buckhead, hired 2 part-time employees, and begun staging high-end homes for real estate listings. My mother spoke about this business the way she spoke about Denise generally, as though it were the most natural and inevitable expression of raw talent. Denise's business was, in my mother's telling, always 3 months away from explosive growth. It just needed one more infusion of capital, one more bridge loan, one more favor from someone who loved her enough to invest. I had, over the years, provided several of those bridges, a $4,200 loan in 2016 that was never repaid, a $7,500 cosign on a vehicle lease that I was eventually forced to cover when Denise defaulted, and a $3,000 gift in 2019 that my mother reframed as a birthday present I had volunteered, though I remembered the phone call clearly. It lasted 14 minutes, and my mother cried twice. The irony was that I had spent my entire professional life identifying when records had been altered to make a loss look like a decision, when a debt had been reclassified as a gift after the fact, when the paper trail told one story and the people involved told another. I did this 40 hours a week under fluorescent lighting, and every Thanksgiving I sat across from the most sophisticated version of exactly that system and passed the sweet potatoes. In September of 2021, I received a call from the Oconee County Tax Assessor's office. A woman named Rita asked me to confirm my mailing address because they had received a change of address form for the lake property. I had not submitted one. Rita read me the new address on file. It was my mother's address in Decatur. I thanked Rita. I hung up. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Oconee County Property Records portal. The deed was still in my name, but there was a new document attached, a limited power of attorney, dated August 2, 2021, granting my mother authority to act on my behalf regarding the property. My signature was on it. Except it wasn't my signature. The document was almost correct. My full legal name was properly rendered, Claire Louise Ellison, middle name matching my grandmother's. The notary stamp was from a legitimate notary in DeKalb County. The date format was consistent with Georgia filing standards. The signature was close enough that someone glancing at it would not have questioned it, but I noticed 2 things immediately. First, I sign my middle initial with a loop that extends below the baseline. It's a habit from years of initialing hundreds of compliance documents. The signature on this form had no loop. The L sat flat on the line, printed rather than cursive. Second, and this is the one that made me sit very still for a very long time, the document properties, when I accessed the digital filing through the county portal's metadata viewer, showed the file had been created on July 28, 2021. 5 days before the date printed on the face of the document. Someone had prepared it before the date it supposedly was signed. That was the first thing the false record got wrong. I did not call my mother. I did not call Denise. I called Harold Crenshaw, my grandmother's attorney, and asked him to pull every document filed against the lake property since the probate was completed. Harold called me back the next morning. There were 3 additional filings I had not authorized. A second power of attorney document, broader in scope, a listing agreement with a real estate brokerage in Seneca, South Carolina, and a completed sale contract, dated November 3, 2021, transferring the lake house to a buyer named Martin Cahoe for $267,000. My mother had sold my inherited lake house, the one my grandmother left to me, by name, in a will filed with the court. She had forged my authorization, listed it without my knowledge, and completed the sale. The $267,000 went into an account I had never seen. I spent 3 weeks after that night building what I'm about to show you. But first, if someone has ever told a story about you that you weren't in the room to correct, I want to know. Drop it below. This one's for all of us. Layer by layer, here is what the record actually shows. The obvious surface. My mother sold a house that was not hers to sell. That alone was fraud. But I had been trained for 14 years to understand that the obvious finding is almost never the final one. It is the first page of a file that goes much deeper. The deliberate construction came next. The forged power of attorney was not a hasty fabrication. I obtained a copy of the notary log from the DeKalb County notary, whose stamp appeared on the document. The log showed that on August 2, 2021, the date on the face of the document, the notary had witnessed 4 signings between 10 a.m. and noon. My name did not appear in the log. Not as Claire Ellison, not as C.L. Ellison, not under any variation. The notary stamp was real, but it had been applied to a document that was never presented in person. Harold confirmed that the notary was a friend of Denise's former employer at the property management company. Someone had borrowed access to a stamp, someone who knew how real estate filings were supposed to look. That brought me to what the total didn't yet account for. This was not the first time my mother had redirected an asset meant for me. When my grandmother was still alive, in 2018, she had given me a savings bond worth $10,000, purchased in 1991, matured and payable directly to me. I had asked my mother to hold it in her safe deposit box until I could drive down to cash it. I never saw it again. When I asked about it 8 months later, my mother said she had cashed it with my grandmother's permission and used it to cover Denise's warehouse deposit for Flourish and Frame. She told me my grandmother had agreed. My grandmother, when I asked her during a visit that Christmas, looked at me blankly and said, "What bond?" She had no memory of approving anything. She asked me to hand her the remote, and I watched her flip to a rerun of Matlock, and I let it go. I let it go because I wanted the version of my family where that answer made sense. That was the older pattern. My mother had been reclassifying assets for years, not as theft, but as family generosity she had authorized on everyone's behalf. The lake house was not an aberration. It was the largest installment in a pattern that stretched back at least a decade. And then I found where the $267,000 went. Harold's paralegal, a woman named Kendra, helped me subpoena the bank records associated with the sale. The $267,000 from the lake house closing had been deposited into an LLC account registered in Denise's name, Flourish and Frame Enterprises LLC, on November 9, 2021. Within 6 weeks, $189,000 had been disbursed, $74,000 to a new warehouse lease in a different part of Buckhead, $38,000 to a vendor in High Point, North Carolina, for staging furniture, $22,000 in payroll, $16,000 to a luxury car dealership in Alpharetta, a lease payment on a white Range Rover Evoque that Denise had been photographed standing beside in an Instagram post captioned, "God is good, and so is growth," and $39,000 transferred to my mother's personal checking account, listed in Flourish and Frame's books as a consulting fee. My grandmother's house, the one with the kitchen window that caught the morning light, the dock I'd helped her grandfather nail into place when I was 12, the bedroom where I read every Nancy Drew novel in order during the summer of 1995, had been converted into a warehouse lease, a furniture order, payroll for employees who didn't know where the money came from, a luxury car, and a $39,000 payment to the woman who orchestrated all of it. My mother had sold my inheritance, forged my name to do it, funneled the proceeds into my sister's failing business, paid herself a fee, and then told everyone that I was the one who refused to help. That was the full record. That was what the false narrative was built to conceal. Harold Crenshaw drafted a letter. 7 pages, every document referenced, every discrepancy cited, every filing traced to its origin. I signed it on a Thursday evening at Harold's office in Anderson, and I mailed it to my mother's address in Decatur via certified mail, return receipt requested. But before that letter arrived, my mother hosted a dinner at her home, the same home she had staged, over the years, as the center of our family's togetherness. She had invited my aunt, my uncle, 2 cousins, Denise and Denise's husband Greg. She had not invited me. She did not know I knew anything. I arrived anyway. I knocked on her front door at 6:15 p.m. on a Saturday, with a manila envelope under my arm, and Harold Crenshaw standing behind me on the porch. My mother opened the door and looked at me as though I had arrived at the wrong house. "We weren't expecting you, Claire. There's not really room at the table." I stepped inside. The dining room was set with her good china, the Wedgwood she inherited from her own mother, the set she only used when she wanted the room to feel important. Denise was seated at one end, Greg beside her, my aunt and uncle across. There was a roast on the table, green beans, a pie cooling on the sideboard. I set the manila envelope on the table, beside the bread basket. I said, "This contains the full record of what happened to Grandma's lake house. Every document, every account, every forged signature." My mother's face did not change. "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened the envelope and placed the first document on the table, the limited power of attorney with the forged signature. "This is a power of attorney filed with Oconee County. My name is on it. I didn't sign it. The notary log confirms I was never present." Denise leaned forward. "Claire, this is really not the time or place." I placed the second document beside the first, the sale contract. "This is the closing document for the sale of the lake house. The proceeds, $267,000, were deposited into your LLC account, Denise." My mother set down her fork. "You're embarrassing yourself. That property was always going to be sold. Your grandmother would have wanted the family taken care of." I placed the third document, the bank disbursement record. I didn't speak. I let the numbers sit. My aunt picked it up. She read it slowly. She looked at my mother and said nothing for a long time. "Claire has always been dramatic," my mother said. "She had issues after the divorce. Ask anyone." "That's not what this is," I said. "You're doing this because you're jealous of Denise. You always have been. She has drive, she has vision, and you have spreadsheets." I said nothing. "After everything I've done for this family," my mother continued, and her voice finally cracked, not with grief but with the effort of maintaining the performance under this much weight. "After every sacrifice I have made, this is how you repay me, in front of everyone." Harold Crenshaw spoke from the doorway. He had remained standing near the entrance. He said quietly, "Mrs. Ellison, I drew up Louise's will, I filed it with the court, and I can confirm that every document Claire has presented tonight is authentic, and every document filed against that property without her consent constitutes forgery under Georgia Code Section September 1st, 16. My mother looked at Harold as though he had materialized from nowhere. He had known my grandmother for 23 years. He had sat in this very dining room at Christmas in 2019. My mother had poured him coffee and called him a blessing. I looked at my mother. The Wedgwood was still clean, the roast was still steaming. The room she had built to prove that everything was fine was the room where it all came apart. I said one sentence. I did not raise my voice. "You sold my grandmother's house, forged my name, and then told everyone I was the greedy one, because the lie was easier to maintain than the debt." I did not elaborate. I let the silence hold. Greg, Denise's husband, had been staring at the disbursement record since my aunt set it down. He looked at Denise. "The warehouse lease, you told me your mother loaned you that money from a CD she cashed out." Denise didn't answer. Greg stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and walked out the front door. I heard his car start 14 seconds later. The certified letter arrived at my mother's address the following Tuesday. Harold had included a cover letter offering two paths: voluntary restitution of the full $267,000 plus filing fees, or a criminal complaint for forgery and fraud. My mother chose neither. She chose silence. So Harold filed. The Oconee County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation in January 2022. By March, the forged power of attorney had been formally invalidated by court order. My mother was charged with 1 count of forgery in the first degree and 1 count of theft by conversion. She entered a guilty plea in September 2022, was sentenced to 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay restitution of $267,000, structured over 8 years at $2,781.25 per month. Flourish and Frame Enterprises LLC was dissolved in April 2022, after the bank froze the LLC account pending the investigation. Denise lost the Buckhead warehouse, the staging inventory, and the Range Rover, which was repossessed in June. She moved back to Decatur, into my mother's house, which was now encumbered by a restitution lien. My aunt, my mother's sister Pauline, was the one whose arc I watched most carefully. Pauline had been at that dinner table. She had read the disbursement record. She had said nothing that night, but 3 weeks later, she called me. She said, "I knew something wasn't right when your mama started talking about selling that house before the probate was even finished. I should have said something then." I told her I appreciated the call. She asked if I could forgive her for not speaking sooner. I said I needed time. She said she understood, and she didn't push. 7 months later, Pauline drove to Anderson and sat in Harold Crenshaw's waiting room for 2 hours to provide a sworn statement about a conversation she'd overheard in 2018, in which my mother discussed handling the savings bond before I could cash it. That statement became part of the restitution filing. Pauline and I are speaking now. There is a warmth between us that is real, and a gap that is also real, and we are both honest about both. My mother's church friends, the ones who had received her version of events for 3 years, received a different kind of correction. Harold, at my request, sent a brief factual summary of the court's findings to the 6 individuals my mother had named in a deposition as people she had confided in about my supposed abandonment of the family. 3 of them called me, 2 of them cried. One of them said, "I repeated what your mother told me to at least 4 other people. I am so sorry." I thanked her. I did not tell her it was fine, because it wasn't. Denise sent me a text message in November 2022. It read, "I know what happened was wrong. I should have stopped it. I'm sorry you got hurt." I read it several times. It was not an apology for what she did. It was an apology for what happened to me, as though she had been standing nearby while weather occurred. I did not respond. I have not responded. I may, one day. But the record will need to be corrected between us first, not just referenced in a text that costs nothing to send. The restitution payments have been arriving, monthly, since January 2023. My mother has not missed one. I deposit each check into a dedicated account I opened at a credit union in Anderson. I have not spent any of it. I am saving it for a specific purpose. The lake house was resold by Martin Kehoe in 2023. I could not buy it back. He had renovated it, raised the price, and sold it to a young couple from Greenville. The kitchen window still faces east. I know because I drove past it once, on a Saturday morning in April, and I slowed down long enough to see the light coming through the glass. It looked the same. The house didn't care who held the deed. But I bought land. Half an acre on the south shore of Lake Hartwell, 4 miles from where my grandmother's house stood. Harold found it. The lot had been on the market for 11 months because it was oddly shaped and had no road frontage until the county approved an easement in 2023. I paid for it in cash, $41,500, from my own savings, not from the restitution account. That money is mine. I built a small deck on the lot this past spring. I go there on weekends. I sit in a chair my grandmother would have recognized, the aluminum frame folding kind with the woven straps, the same style she kept on her dock, and I read. Sometimes Nancy Drew, because I never stopped loving them, and because returning to something you loved before the damage is its own kind of correction. The version of events my mother told, that I was offered a fair share and refused it, was not a misunderstanding. It was a narrative engineered to make fraud look like family sacrifice, and to make the person who was defrauded look like the one who failed to show up. That is what false records do. They don't just hide the truth. They replace it with a version that makes the people around you complicit in the lie, without knowing they've been recruited. Every person who repeated my mother's story became, without their consent, part of the architecture that kept me silent. Not because they were cruel, but because they trusted the source, and the source understood exactly how much that trust was worth as currency. I think about what it costs to live inside someone else's false version of you. It is not dramatic. It is not a single wound. It is an accumulation of small moments, a pause on the other end of a phone call, an invitation that doesn't arrive, a conversation that stops when you enter a room, and each one is deniable on its own. It is only when you line them up, the way I line up audit discrepancies in a compliance file, that the pattern becomes unmistakable. And by then the record has been circulating long enough that correcting it feels like an act of aggression to the people who already accepted it as fact. But the record exists, the real one, filed, notarized, authenticated, and upheld by a court. It says what happened, it names who did it does not editorialize. And no amount of tears at a dinner table, no number of church parking lot conversations, no text message that costs nothing to send can alter what a document trail has already made permanent. I am sitting on that deck right now. The lake is flat and silver this morning, and the light is coming through the trees at an angle that reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen window, the way it hit the formica and made it look almost golden. I have a cup of coffee, I have a book. My name is Claire Louise Ellison, and the record is correct. If you told someone else's story without them in the room, whose version did you tell? And when the full record finally came out, did you go back and correct the version you passed on? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.